And that's where I also want to start with some kind of disclaimer saying that we're not going to discuss Turkish-Ukrainian relations or Turkish-Russian relations generally, but rather I will focus on the vulnerabilities towards Russian possible or existing malign influences. And that's why I'm not going to talk about all the positive agenda that we have in Turkish-Ukrainian relations, which is of course there, but that's just another topic for discussion. And just today's we're talking here in Turkey, there will be a National Security Council meeting where again the situation in Ukraine and Russian aggression in Ukraine will be discussed. So of course, as Ukrainians, we appreciate Turkey's help to Ukraine in this war of aggression. With this being said, it's also important to understand that, as you mentioned, Turkey is a very interesting case for consideration and for research, because if you look on the factual side of Turkish resources, Turkish military, Turkey's been one of the most powerful NATO nations. Turkey's been the second largest armed forces in NATO, having its own navy, very well developed indigenous technological solutions, including the very famous Bayraktar drones, but not limited to that. And also Turkey's economy. It's obvious that we cannot compare the case of Turkey, for example, to that of Moldova or Bulgaria that you mentioned, because this is a power, and all experts, I mean, worldwide are discussing the growing foreign policy ambitions of the Republic of Turkey. On the other hand, there are certain things that actually limit this, and I would argue, and that's what I'm writing about also in my paper, that very often they are self-imposed. So there is a perceived understanding or belief that Turkey does not have a luxury of not cooperating with Russia, for example, or that Russia is a powerful state that anyhow has to be respected, accommodated, and so on, just because this is a neighbor and geography dictate that. So very often it's mostly about cultural tradition, historical tradition also, right? And some, let's say, strategic thinking issues, which I would say limit the real strengths of the Republic of Turkey towards Russia. So since we've been examining several different blocks of information, I will go one by one very briefly and focus on several issues there. And I started from this strategic thinking point because I really believe this is important in Turkish case exactly to understand that this is not something that we're just discussing now in the 21st century, that the relations between Turkey and Russia go back as far as to relations between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And mostly that was a relationship of wars and direct confrontation and rivalry for the strategic dominance in the Black Sea region, but also in the Mediterranean. So on the one hand, this tells us that Russia is seen as a strategic rival and adversary in Turkey, just because there are so many overlapping interests in different regions. And today this is also the case. And today, Russia and Turkey are also backing opposing sides in many regional conflicts, starting from Syria, Libya, and then to Ukraine, to Georgia, to the South Caucasus, and then this, warm water seas issue. That's a huge history of confrontation and rivalry there. But on the other hand, if you look at the history of this Russo-Ottoman war, then you'll see that most of the in most of those wars, Turkey was actually defeated by Russia, and hence there still is this myth of Great Russia, a very powerful neighbor, a major regional force in the region. So there is a desire to de-escalate, or at least to manage this escalation with Russia every time there is a direct clash of interest between the two countries. And that's also where Russia has certain leverages over Turkey in the Black Sea and in the Mediterranean. Again, with everything which is going on now in Ukraine, with Russia being bogged down there, and with all these major failures and defeats, most of these myths of Russian greatness, they are very slowly, very gradually being debunked, and we see how this perception is changing. how Turkey actually tries to also benefit from Russia's weakening because of the situation in Ukraine. But still, there is a long way to go and a long road to take, because it's been for centuries this myth and ideas of great Russia, Russian power, Russian culture, Russian whatever military, navy power. And that's why there is sometimes, as I say, desire to rather have a dialogue and to accommodate Russia than just to have this, open confrontation. Then, besides that, another issue is a huge distrust of the Western partners and the problems that Turkey historically had, let's say, with the Western countries. Many experts would remember this so-called Sever syndrome, when there is this huge mistrust and distrust of the West, starting from the early 20th century, when large territories of Turkey were actually occupied by the Western powers. And then all these conspiracy theories, which for a variety of reasons are quite widespread in Turkey now. And even today, if you look at the social polls, you will see that many people still do not see, let's say, the United States or the European Union as a reliable and credible partner. That's why Russia is not very often seen as a reliable partner either. But it's kind of a necessity to cooperate with Russia just because you are surrounded with the enemies. And again, we can discuss why this happened. It's not only because I can kind of sense that many would argue from the Turkish side that that's also the United States and the EU to be blamed for that. And I agree partially, because basically this is on both sides. But we have the reality, and this reality is very favorable for Russia. Just because having these very often misperceptions, misunderstandings, divergent interests of NATO allies, sometimes NATO allies not understanding and paying attention to Turkey's security demands and Turkey's security concerns. Sometimes Turkey's very nationalistic rhetoric, especially now on the eve of the elections, parliamentary, presidential elections, that's also part of the conjuncture and domestic agenda, this criticism of the Western powers. So this brings to the situation when basically you have not pro-Russian, but anti-Western sentiments in Turkey, which is super widespread. And that's why it's quite easy for Russia also to promote its narratives and to promote its propaganda. Talking about hard security issues, there is also a bunch of problems which are related to the Western sanctions on Turkey's defense industry, on the problems in cooperation between Turkey and NATO. We all know the S-400 issue. I'm not going into detail there. The F-16, F-35 issue. So every time there is a problem with the West, there is a desire on the Turkish side first to get the weapons and advanced technologies it needs, but also to use it as, I would say, a bargaining, chipping dialogue with the West, just to say that in case we are kind of rejected by the West, then we have another partner. So this is kind of this diversification going to Russia, because we want to be everywhere. We want to be a regional power which has this strategic autonomy from the West. And that's how we want to cooperate with Russia, sometimes with Iran, like in Astana platform, sometimes with China. And this also very much fuels this Eurasianist agenda in Turkey, which is different from the Russian Eurasianism, but which is still harmful and, I would argue, destructive for Turkey's relations with NATO, with the European Union, and with the Western European transatlantic partners. But this is a part of the problem, because it's not always that Turkey wants to cooperate with Russia, but just because it sees it as an alternative to the West. And this general narrative of confronting the US-led hegemonic US power, US-led unipolar world. So Turkey and Russia and some other regional powers have to redesign the whole global order to make it more fair for regional powers. This is also playing very much into Russian hands, and that's why every time I speak about this, I say the strategic autonomy is to be welcomed, but that should be not only from the West, but also strategic autonomy from Russia as well. And for that, Turkey does need to improve relations with the EU and NATO partners. And another point is also about some economic dependencies and some structural dependencies which Turkey has on Russia. And again, we can discuss whether these are interdependencies now, because Russia is also heavily dependent on Turkey. The only window to Europe, especially after European and American sanctions were introduced. But on the other hand, the structure of Turkey's economy shows us that despite the positive moves in diversification of energy supplies in terms of routes, in terms of resources and partners, Turkey still is heavily dependent on Russia in gas supplies. It's more than 45% based on the data of 2022. And the recent idea of building a regional hub, which will be very much reliant on Russian gas again, and very much unwelcome by other Turkish partners. That's not a move in the right direction, in my humble opinion. So becoming a regional power hub is important, but not by including even more Russian gas, already having Blue Stream, Turk Stream, and already having Russia as one of the major suppliers of gas to Turkey. And the same goes for the Russian oil, coal, and nuclear energy, which is also an important and very much, I would say, often ignored issue. You know that Russian Rosatom is now building Akkuyu nuclear power plant in Turkey. There are also discussions about possibly building another one in Sinop. This is still, the discussions are ongoing, but the problem with that is that nuclear technology is a very long journey, and it's not only about building something physically in Turkey. It's also about the model on which it's being built, and that's a build, own, operate model, meaning that there will be Russian operators there, that will be owned by Rosatom, and basically the Russian side is very often referring to this as the first Russian nuclear power plant outside of Russia. So one would be interested to hear how much of control Turkey will have over the nuclear power plant strategic facility on its territory. It's quite close to the to Syria, where Russian troops and radars and everything are situated. It's quite close to Incirlik, a NATO base. Then you have the still occupied Crimea and the Russian aggression in the Black Sea. So the question is how much of the physical safety and security you have there, how credible a partner Russia is in nuclear technologies, knowing what Russia is doing in Ukraine with the Ukrainian NPPs, basically using it as a weapon in its warfare on the democratic world. And then a whole bunch of issues which are related to what do you do with the fuel, what do you do with the wasted fuel, which also has to be stored somewhere, and that's also where you are dependent in Russia, and whether it would be used as another Russian naval base on the Mediterranean coast, because obviously there might be some parts where the access is closed or denied for outsiders. Last point, which I believe is also quite important, and I'm going to wrap up here before going to recommendations, is the informational sphere. And I believe that Emre would also jump in there to comment on that, because I know, Emre, that you're a very, very well-known expert on that. Unfortunately, I would say this is one of the most vulnerable areas in Turkey towards Russian influences for a variety of reasons. One is just because, as I mentioned before, there are very many narratives which are overlapping between Turkey and Russia, perception of what is going on. The problem here is that very much the spread of these narratives is not even up to Russian information operations, but they are integrated in the Turkish domestic discourse. So you don't even have, let's say, to finance some TV channel or media outlet to spread some information which would be favorable to Russia, just because there is so much criticism of the US, of the Western world, of the whatever, you know, NATO, than the cooperation between the enemies of Turkey or some terror organizations and groups like, you know, Fethullah Gülen's terror organization and PKK and so on. And very often they are also supported by Russia, by the way, like the PKK. And you know that there are all these open data on how Russia is also cooperating with the Kurdish terrorists, but still the criticism of Russia is almost non-existent. And then there is all this criticism of the Western cooperation. Plus, besides that, for example, Sputnik or Radio Sputnik, they're still functional in Turkey and they're quite popular. Their popularity is decreasing, but still they have millions of subscribers on Twitters, on YouTubes. And the problem is that for some journalists, that was seen as a safe haven against kind of governmental control in Turkey, because Russia presented those media outlets as a safe haven against Turkish government control. So some of the once reputable journalists joined those media outlets just to share their views. And then there is this mixture of truth and lies and everything that made it popular for some time at least. Russo-Ottoman, Russian house is very active in Ankara with all kind of, you know, these events which are discredited in Ukraine and justifying the aggression of Russia in Ukraine, which is interesting because we know the Turkey's official position of non-recognition of the illegal annexed territories, but still these are the narrative they are promoting. And unfortunately, there are still all these cases of cooperation between Russian TASS agency, for example, and then Anadolu agency or some other state agencies. So very much you can see this content which has been taken from the Russian media and then broadcasted in Turkey, and then you might have or might not have alternative views on that, but still this is the part of the Turkish media space. So going to recommendations very briefly, I would say that for the Turkish side, the situation in some respect has been improving in a way that Russia has been weakened. So understanding that Russia is a pariah state, increasingly isolated state, might help switch the focus of attention to still other more credible partners in the region, like, for example, Ukraine. And here I'm saying that not because I'm Ukrainian myself, and of course we would like to develop cooperation with the Turkish partners, but because this is the case where there is no this big power competition between Ukraine and Turkey, there is no this NATO presence, physical presence in the Black Sea basin, but Ukraine is always a natural counterweight and deterrent to Russian influence in the region. And it's not only about military power, but also economically speaking, talking about nuclear technologies, talking about all other spheres. So that would be one of the recommendations probably for the Turkish government to reconsider that and still to diversify partners, and then to understand that it's not always Russia who provides strategic autonomy from the West to Turkey, but quite the other way around, who tries to increase Turkey's dependency on Russia. Building resilience is important, especially in cybersecurity and informational sphere, and for that political will is needed. So hopefully after the elections, when there will be not such a sensitive political environment in Turkey, much more attention will be paid to that. And diversification of partners, including in energy, including in economy, of course, is crucial, just because the very realization of the fact that over-relying on one single partner is a vulnerability in itself for Turkey is important. So moving away from Russia would really help to basically boost this autonomy of Turkey in the region. But there are also some recommendations for the Western partners, and that is to try to keep Turkey engaged with the West and try to still, though it's a tough partner, it's a difficult partner, but that's a partner, and that's how Turkey should be seen. And for that, of course, providing alternatives to Russian financial resources, which are now very much fueling Turkey's economy by increasing foreign investments in Turkey, helping Turkey diversify energy supplies and promote projects with energy partners like Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, some others would really help. And generally working with Turkey, as I mentioned before, on information cybersecurity, providing tailor-made solutions for deterring that influence of Russia would be really, really important.